Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Khalil Jahshan. I'm the Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and I would like to welcome all of you to this special webinar focusing on assessing the reform process in Jordan, political dissatisfaction, economic challenges, and the focus on stability. By way of introduction, let me say a few words, and then I will be delighted to and honored to introduce our speakers for this panel. In a region with more than its fair share of conflict, public opinion surveys consistently reflect a steady rate of political dissatisfaction and also vigorous demand for political reform. In its polling of 14 Arab countries, including Jordan, Arab Opinion Index 2022, the last one we held at the Arab Center, showed an average of 52% of respondents stating that their respective country is headed in the wrong direction for adverse economic and political conditions, bad governance, endemic corruption, and lack of stability, among other things. Indeed, the viewpoint, this viewpoint was shared by almost 84% of respondents in the Levant, in the Mashriq, including, of course, Jordan. Indeed, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan has not been immune to the persistent regional trends that these public opinion reflect, from the widespread public demands for reform, despite the repeated attempts by successive governments in Jordan to do that in recent decades. Yet, although the kingdom has long been touted as a beacon of peace and stability and moderation, and continues consequently to receive financial, military, and political support from Western allies, Jordan's domestic politics have been caught between its efforts to ensure that stability in the country through recurrent, formally asserted attempts at reform, on the one hand, and intensifying popular discontent and socio-political mobilization in support of more tangible reform on the other hand. Over the last several years, Jordan has witnessed renewed waves of protest and a growing political opposition movement that together reflect deepening political dissatisfaction and economic grievances, and that represent diverse segments of Jordanian society across economic, social, ethnic, and religious lines in the country. Protesters have organized against rising food and fuel prices, corruption, repressive security forces, restrictions on speech and assembly, high youth unemployment rates, vanishing government subsidies, and the absence sometimes of the rule of law. In response, the Jordanian government has presented several rounds of reform initiatives in recent years, the latest of which was the formation of the Royal Committee to modernize the political system going back to June 2021. I know that Curtis has written on that in the past, with the aim of producing what we were told, a 10-year reform plan to establish strong parliamentary governance and create new laws governing elections and political parties. So, Arab Center Washington, D.C. is convening this panel of distinguished experts who have dealt with these issues extensively over the years to discuss the reform process and its prospects for creating real change for the people of Jordan. Our speakers will examine the details of current reform efforts, evaluate whether they can be implemented effectively and have a meaningful impact on daily life in the kingdom, and propose recommendations to address concerns over governance, economic crises, rising restrictions on freedom of the press, free speech, and freedom of assembly, among others. They will also assess the current socioeconomic and political conditions that triggered past protests, as well as the impact of neoliberal economic policies, the influence of Jordan's tribal system on these attempts at reform, the implications of a newly announced cybercrime law in recent months and last couple of years, and U.S. policy proposals to support real reform in Jordan. We have 4 participants in this panel. I will introduce them at this time, and then they will each have 10 to 12 minutes to present a summary of their work on this issue, which will leave us probably about 30 minutes at the end for Q&A to engage in the art of conversation with you in the audience. Feel free, please, to use the Q&A feature on your Zoom page, or if you would like to email your questions, you might do that at events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, events@arabcenterdc.org. Please identify yourself, your affiliation, make your question brief. If you care to address it to a specific participant, feel free to do that. I will read your questions or try to cover as many of them as possible within the time allocated for the Q&A. Our first speaker would be Curtis Ryan, professor of political science at Appalachian State University. Curtis has written a lot on this topic, including for Arab Center. He will be dealing essentially with the background of the issue, putting the current events and popular protests in Jordan into a broader historical, social, and political context. Tuqa Nusayrat is the Director for Strategy Operations and Finance at the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. She will be focusing her remarks on helping us understand the protests and opposition movements in Jordan in light of the deteriorating socioeconomic conditions, alleged corruption, increased repression by security forces, and the absence of the rule of law. Arwa Shobaki is the Managing Director of Project on Middle East Democracy, POMED. She will focus her remarks on the situation, particularly of youth in Jordan, who are definitely a majority of the population, as we all know. She will cover issues pertaining to unemployment, use of drugs, political apathy, issues pertaining to freedom of speech and press, particularly the new cybercrime law, and Western focus on stability in the country and recommendations for U.S. policy in this regard. Last but not least, Sean Yom, Associate Professor of Political Science at Temple University, Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program, Foreign Policy Research Institute. He will give us a summary, if you will, of all the conversation by focusing on understanding the 10-year reform process and prospects for establishing a constitutional monarchy in Jordan, the impact of regional developments and global rise of authoritarianism on reforms in Jordan. With that, I will go ahead and turn the microphone on to Curtis to introduce us to give us the background on this subject matter. Curtis, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Khalil. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for everybody for coming, and hello to all my colleagues here. I'm looking forward to what you have to say as well. I'm going to try to put this in a broader context, the whole reform question in the context of both historical context and social and political context as well. This is, the latest in a series of reform initiatives. So this one is really more or less 2 years in, since the Modernization Committee was charged in 2021 and fairly short order came up with a really detailed, fairly lengthy set of recommendations for political reform in the kingdom. So in terms of the context, though, for people who are familiar with Jordan, and certainly Jordanians themselves, know that the reform issue has been on the table in varying degrees for quite a few decades. So a lot of people still look at the original 1989 process as the kind of golden era of reform in Jordanian history and politics. In that moment, in 1989, the system opened up both politically and controversially, I would say economically. That's hence the neoliberal reform questions. But politically speaking, it led to, in 1991, the national charter, which included bringing back political parties that had been a part of Jordanian political life legally up through the 1950s, had continued, but not legally, and not in a really big role in the many, many decades that followed, from the late 50s, the martial law era, straight up until 1991, where martial law ended, political parties were legalized, parliamentary elections had been restored. At least competitive parliamentary elections had been restored in 1989. So we got a series of elections after that. And for most of them, with only a few exceptions, we've seen a new electoral law and sometimes a new parties law, pretty much almost every electoral cycle. So a lot of these had been temporary electoral laws, put forward for that election purpose. That's one round, and there are a couple more that are worth noting here. In 2005, there was a very different kind of round of reform with what was known as the National Agenda. That was another ambitious set of reform proposals, some of which are mirrored in the more recent proposals, because that included the idea, for example, of empowering political parties, of increasing the percentage of parliamentary seats allocated to parties with each election cycle, which is kind of where we are now. At the time, though, almost all those reforms were shelved. That became politically really controversial. It was torpedoed pretty quickly, led to a lot of resistance, and essentially didn't go very far. At the time of the regional Arab Spring, though, the Arab uprisings, we see at least a third round of reforms and political openings of various types. I would say especially 2011 to 2013, new political parties law, new electoral law, changes to the Constitution. And all of this in each of these phases is accompanied by rounds of protest and street activism. And so no shortage of public activism, just not necessarily at the ballot box, where turnout has tended to get lower over the cycle of elections. So in many ways, the 2011 and after period, that set of reforms set up a lot of possibilities. And that includes not just in legislative reforms, but in the King's own whole series of discussion papers over the next several years, some of which talked about parties and elections and opening up parliaments and eventually parliamentary governments. So the most recent round in 2021 is the new Modernization Committee round. So I think it's really important to see it in this broader context of, and in the sense that I think people can be forgiven for being a little skeptical, having experienced various rounds of reform, some of which people were supportive of, some people were cynical about, but not all were either implemented or were implemented, and then there was regression in that topic, right? So that, as is true of every round of reform I'm familiar with at this point, there are always people, even who support the reform proposals, who want to know if that's, is it going to proceed this time? Is it real? Should we expect this to actually be implemented, and are waiting to see? And I think that's kind of where we are, because this is a more or less 10-year reform span that is supposed to be over the next 3 election cycles. So part of the reform package, and it's an extensive package of topics, is talking about reforming political parties and the electoral system. Parties have re-registered themselves to be approved. So we have, more than 24 political parties at the moment in Jordan that are expecting to participate in the 2024 elections. And when they do, they're expecting to work with a 2-ballot system. So that on the one hand, you will do what is a bit more familiar to most voters, and that is vote for the representative for a district. The other ballot, which was something was tried out in the 2013 election, will be for a political party. So we have redistricted on the one hand and have different districts for the representatives, but also a kind of collective national district for the party lists. And the idea here is that the significant chunk of the the upcoming parliament would come from those parties. And then that next round, more or less half, and the final round, or at least the third, 65% or so, with the idea that this is eventually going to keep going, and that will slowly build a party framework where you have, very importantly, not just parties, but programmatic parties that have actual recognizable platforms and policies. And that is not necessarily the case with a lot of the parties now. Some do, some don't. So that the idea also is that the system is designed so the parties will eventually coalesce so that you wouldn't have, for example, 28 parties in parliament at the same time. They would have to merge. And you end up with something like the phrase you always hear is left, right, and center parties would form in some capacity, presumably more than three. But that's basically where we are. Now, there's some important twists here too, I think. Adding that 20% of parliament or of the candidates on the party lists are going to be women, that 20% will be youth, that people who with disabilities have to be represented on your party list, that it has to have a list that covers at least 6 different governorates in the kingdom so that it's not a specifically regional party. So there are a lot of ifs here of how to assemble your party and try to make it work. And even the running order of names on the list, especially for the first 5, might turn out to be significant. But a lot of this is has been thought out, I would say, in some detail, but we don't know yet what the impact will be. The 2024 election hasn't happened yet, and obviously neither have the next 2. So there's a lot of possibility here for what could turn out to be significant change. So I already put into context why there will be a significant amount of skepticism. And that's actually, I think, vitally important because on the one hand, voter participation rates have been staggeringly low, actually. So motivating people to actually vote would be important. And that would only happen if they're convinced that the reform is real, that the parties are significant, that they have meaningful choices. And very importantly, and this is not a big part of the reform, that parliament itself as an institution would be politically significant, that it would have some power, that it wouldn't be, fairly hollow debating society kind of institution. So even if the electoral and party reforms work fabulously, there is still the question of what about parliament as an institution? What about institutional reform? And one other thing I'd layer into there is this. Party life has been actively discouraged in Jordan since the 1950s, since the late 1950s. So, we have less than 1% of the public has tended to support a political party. So to get a real party system up and going, part of the task here is to convince people that party life is okay, and actually not only okay, but actively encouraged. And then to do that, to be supportive of that, so that if people join political parties, they don't find themselves on a list. And part of the reform package talks about protecting party affiliation, headquarters, finances, public records, activism on campus, things like that in the past have been really problematic. So this is also, I would add to the, let's see how this works out phase, because those are really good ideas. And we'll see if it actually, works out that way. The other part I would add is this: socially, in addition to the political reforms, parties, elections, parliament, if you ask most people, and my colleagues I know are going to hit on various aspects of this, if you ask most people what they're really concerned with, it's not that they don't necessarily care about these things. It's just not at the top of their list, in the same way that huge crises and scandals and things like that have made the waves over even recent years, everything from the Prince Hamza situation to the Pandora Papers, etc. These are things that every Jordanian knows about, every Jordanian has talked about, every Jordanian has opinion about, but they're not necessarily on the top of the list either. I think for most people, it's a very socioeconomic topping of the list. As a practical matter, I would say it's fair. I think it's fair to say that most people are more concerned with the unemployment rate, with the cost of living. And that means basically in whatever order, the cost of housing, food, fuel, the kind of big 3 there for most people, I would say, are going to top their list. And one other very important political factor, and I'll end with this so that we have plenty of time for everybody, is something that sounds contradictory to the reform process, which is the reform process is really lengthy document that included a very large committee that was fairly eclectic, especially by the standard of previous blue ribbon commissions. And it has this ambitious set of reform prospects, especially on elections and parties and so on. But at the very same time, we see the new cybercrimes law. There is very pervasive concern at a public level, at the most grassroots public and social level, with the ability to speak freely and even comment freely, including right down to liking something on a social media post. So I think those factors have to balance back in, and it's not enough to just look, say, straight, almost like it's in a box at the elections and parties reforms. It depends part depends on what about Parliament itself, what about the other reforms, and what about this broader social context that people at a grassroots level, I think, are really concerned with. Because I do think there's some potential here. We just don't know yet how this is going to play out. But meanwhile, there are very pervasive concerns that actually could be addressed immediately and therefore might help the other concerns and reform issues. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Curtis. Appreciate that. Let's go ahead now and pass the microphone on to Tuka, who will help us to try kind of take the other side of the equation, if you will, and to understand the opposition movement in Jordan in terms of its makeup and its perspective, and how it's focusing on the socioeconomic conditions that seem to be the central issue, as Curtis just explained. Tuka, the next 12 minutes are yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Khalil, Tamara, Nabil, and the whole Arab Center DC team for hosting and organizing this panel. And thank you, Curtis, for setting the scene and giving us some context to where things stand in Jordan today. As you mentioned, a lot of Jordanians are primarily concerned with the economic situation. I'm going to begin with a few numbers that help explain the current sense of frustration and dissatisfaction that Jordanians feel about the economic and political situation in their country. So according to the Arab Barometer's 2022 polling data, over 60% of Jordanians believe that the economy is the biggest challenge facing the country. And only a quarter expect that the economic situation will improve in the next few years. And that's substantially lower than it has been in the past. So not only are they worried about the situation, they are not hopeful that it's going to improve. Over 76% of Jordanians say that the socioeconomic inequality is a major challenge facing the country. And nearly 9 in 10 Jordanians say that corruption is present to a large or medium extent, and that they don't believe that the government is working to tackle that problem effectively. So when they're asked about how the government can address some of these concerns, most Jordanians, 39% say they should create more jobs, 22% say they need to raise living wages, and 20% say they need to support limiting inflation and managing the rising cost of living. Again, these are the main issues that concern the average Jordanian. According to another poll, International Republican Institute's 2022 State of Democracy in Jordan Public Opinion Survey also mentions that 40% of Jordanians that things are mostly going in the wrong direction. In 2020, this was at 24%. So this is a significant rise in the belief that the country is not headed where it should be. And 91% of Jordanians believe that unequal access to opportunities is an obstacle to the development of democracy. So are these public perceptions of the state of the country and the situation of the economy exaggerated? Not necessarily. The reality is that the country has a serious problem, like you mentioned, with unemployment rate being at 22% and the youth unemployment rate at 50%. And I know my colleague Ira will be talking about the youth in more detail, but 63% of the population is under the age of 30. And 35% of the total population, about 4 million Jordanians, are currently living under the poverty line, according to the World Bank. So this has jumped quite a bit because of the rising cost of food and goods. In 2018, that poverty rate was at 16% almost. So you're talking about a significant jump. Other economic concerns are high public debt rates, which is hovering around 110% of GDP. So in terms of where Jordan stands right now, over the past decade, Jordan has suffered a number of shocks that have deepened this economic crisis. In 2020, like the rest of the world, Jordan witnessed the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before that, regional conflicts were on Jordan's borders and poured refugees into the country, putting a strain on the government resources and the country's already limited natural resources. And more recently, the war in Ukraine and the subsequent global economic crisis have also had a negative impact. But as most Jordanian observers will agree, whereas Jordan faced external threats in recent years due to instability in the region, and especially in neighboring countries like Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, Jordan's biggest threat today is much less conflict on its borders or terrorism. It's really internal. And as we will discuss today, record high unemployment, sluggish economy, and more importantly, the declining trust in the government's ability to manage these crises are really the biggest threat to the country right now. The widespread discontent with the way the country is being managed has, of course, spilled into the streets and online, as we mentioned, through various forms of protests and strikes against the government. So only 31% of Jordanians say they trust the government, which is a 41% decrease since 2010. So over a decade, many less Jordanians say they trust the government to take the right steps to address these issues. Trust in parliament, which is part of the reform agenda, is even lower. But the armed forces are the most trusted political force in Jordan. 93% of Jordanians say they trust the armed forces, which is one of the highest in the region. So how do these frustrations spill over into the streets? Let's discuss a little bit about the protests. So protests have long been a part of Jordanian fabric. Dr. Jillian Schwedler just recently wrote a book about protest movements in Jordan. And in Jordan, Jordanians have had the freedom to take to the streets, engage in popular strikes, and demand policy change. Most of these have been around economic concerns, but also demanding political reform. These issues are obviously intertwined. But protests in Jordan have historically been civil. Unlike other regimes in the region, Jordanian governments and the monarchy have allowed them to take place without the kind of violent crackdown that we've seen in Egypt or Syria, for example. But over the past decade, we saw Jordanians participating in protests around the Arab Spring, consistent protests against escalating Israeli violence and the Jordanian government's political stance, economic deals with Israel. The most important protests for the public and for the government are those centered around economic issues and subsequently political dissatisfaction. Touching on the more recent protests that we've seen break out at the end of last year in the southern city of Ma'an, when fuel prices went up because of reduced subsidies and taxing on those commodities. These protests were led by truckers and transportation workers who really felt the pinch. These are average Jordanians who just feel like they can't put food on the table. And they were followed by strikes for quite a bit of time, to almost 2 weeks, cities shutting down and eventually spreading to other parts of the country. And unlike I mentioned, predominantly protests have been peaceful, this one turned violent. A senior political police officer was killed, and then trying to crack down on the suspect, there was more deaths in that process. And the government responded pretty heavily, like I said, with the security presence and also on social media, shutting down TikTok, which was one of the outlets that, a lot of videos of the protests and anti-government chants were spreading. So they're making their way to Jordanian homes, and this was one way to kind of stem that by shutting that outlet down. The state media tended to ignore the protests for a while until the violence erupted, and then this outbreak of violence was used by officials to reframe the protests as a security and terrorism threat. So labeling the protesters as takfiris or Islamic extremists and saboteurs in an attempt to overshadow the anger against rising fuel prices and deteriorating economic conditions in the country. And those strikes were called the dignity strikes, or Idrab al-Karama, in reference to what many felt was attack on Jordanian citizens' dignity because they could no longer afford basic necessities. Interestingly, the teacher strike that started in 2019 was also called a dignity strike. So these are very clear signs of Jordanian public engaging in what they feel is a way to address some of their concerns and their way of speaking to government officials. So how has the Jordanian government responded to this general discontent and declining economic situation? as we know, the COVID crisis led to a state of emergency, and that state of emergency hasn't been lifted. So it gave the government extensive new powers to crack down on civil society and freedom of expression under the guise of addressing the pandemic. But these new restrictions on protests and harsher crackdown on the teachers' union are just an example of how the pandemic was being used to silence opposition movements and public protests. The government has also responded, as you said, with rolling out a number of new reform initiatives. One of them is the economic modernization vision, which is focused on addressing some of these concerns. But the government has rolled out almost 11 plans in the past. And the more recent plan wants to tackle unemployment, which is the biggest concern, by what it says, adding 1 million youth into the job market by 2033. That would mean creating 100,000 jobs per year, which is double the current trend. And as one of our colleagues, Leif Ajloni, writes, the reality is that the number of job openings generated annually falls short of the number of college graduates that end up, entering the job market or wanting to enter the job market. So this new economic vision wants to increase real GDP growth, but it is incredibly ambitious, aiming to increase it by 5.6%, whereas the IMF is projecting that there's no more than 3% in 2023 and maybe 3.1% in 2024. So with this bleak economic outlook and lack of confidence in past government attempts, dissatisfaction and public protests, we anticipate will continue. The questions that we are going to continue to look for answers to is, will the government ramp up its crackdown on these displays of frustration as it has online? Will it do that in the public squares? Will it continue the attacks on the leaders of protests like the Hirak movement and other movements critical of the government? And most importantly, will these protests reach a point where they're able to successfully affect change in the political system and hold government officials accountable as they have in the past? The history of Jordanian protests has been, in some ways, effective, and the way that the economy is going and the way that the government is responding will be something that we watch closely. And I look forward to discussing more of this with my fellow co-panelists.
Thank you very much, Tuka. Next is Arwa Shobaki from POMED. Arwa, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Khalil. Thank you, Arab Center, for hosting this important conversation today. So we can't talk about the future of democracy and human rights in Jordan without talking about the role of youth. Youth make up about 2/3 of the Jordanian population, as my colleagues have already mentioned. Roughly 65% are under the age of 30, which makes Jordan one of the youngest countries in the world. In my remarks today, I'm going to outline how modernization and reform can't succeed if the government doesn't commit real resources toward resolving societal issues, hugely affecting youth. The unemployment crisis is number one. Failing public trust, high political apathy, ineffective governance, and police free speech. A recent poll conducted by Jordan's Center for Strategic Studies found that nearly 3/4 of the population believe that things are getting worse in the kingdom rather than better. Identifying the economy, rising cost of living, high levels of unemployment, corruption, and nepotism as the key contributing factors to these findings. Other polls and studies undertaken the past couple of years, some of which have already been mentioned, specific to youth, have also identified similar concerns. Top on the list of the priorities are civil and political rights protected by the rule of law, respecting freedom of opinion, expression, and the press, economic development, and the importance of combating political and economic corruption. When polled, young people claim to trust more in traditional institutions such as the family, the tribe, and military over their representative institutions. 70% of young people reported not being interested in politics and believe that the overall political and economic situation in Jordan has deteriorated, making the dream of migration more popular. These findings correlate directly with what I also hear in Jordan. I've been told by aspiring professionals, in Jordan, we find our dreams on the road to the airport. And I've heard stories of fresh graduates with university degrees turning to selling drugs to make money at the risk of arrest because of no other professional opportunities. I also heard of desperate youth falsifying documents to establish Syrian identities to take advantage of immigration opportunities in place for refugees to relocate to Western Europe. While these may not be the most savory routes to take for the unemployed, they are indicative of a broader trend linked to despair and desperation in Jordan. Before the pandemic, the economy was already struggling with unemployment, estimated at near 30%, and as high as 50% for youth, and 75% for female youth. Today, the numbers remain significantly unchanged. Coupled with the high level of unemployment and political apathy, there's also been a significant increase of drugs in the country. Drug use, trafficking, and possession. Hashish, crystal meth, synthetic cannabis called jokar, now the Syrian Lebanese produced Captagon. These drugs are relatively cheap and easy to access. The Captagon drug trade and smuggling route through Jordan from Syria has been described as a large criminal enterprise, with smugglers regularly confronting Jordanian patrols and police officers and drug smugglers using drones to get their product into Jordan. Given the high level of unemployment, this dramatic increase of drugs circulating Jordanian streets is definitely cause for concern. Political apathy, no work or prospect for work, and a feeling of hopelessness make a lot of youth vulnerable to either getting involved in the drug trade or becoming users themselves. In addition to the large burden unemployment and joblessness creates among the youth, there are even more fundamental issues, such as heavily policed speech. There are around 9.4 million internet users in Jordan, in a country of 11 million people, including 6.3 million with Facebook accounts. This translates to about 75% of the population active on social media, of which the majority are youth. In a 2023 study undertaken by university researchers in Amman on Jordanian youth political engagement, social media was determined to be the #1 place where youth feel most comfortable engaging. Is where political activism, discussion, and opinion sharing happens. This really comes as no surprise when you consider previous studies that have highlighted political apathy and youth distrust in formal institutions, such as traditional political parties and the parliament. I raise this now because the predominant use of social media among youth is particularly important to consider in light of the new cybercrime law approved by the King on August 12th. The newly passed 40-article cybercrime law is even more restrictive than its predecessor and is described by leading Jordanian and international human rights organizations and free speech advocates as dangerous, overly broad, vague, and open to wide interpretation and abuse. Under the recently passed 2023 cybercrimes law, acts online considered crimes or offenses are punishable with prison terms of up to 3 years and steep fines. These crimes are defined as promoting, instigating, aiding, or inciting immorality, character assassination, inciting sedition or undermining national unity, contempt for religions. Anyone who uses the internet to spread what is likely to target social peace, incite hatred, call for or justify violence is committing a crime. Anyone who intentionally sends, resends, or publishes data or information online that includes fake news targeting national security and community peace or defames slanders any member of the government shall be imprisoned and prosecuted by the public prosecution without the need of anyone even filing a complaint, which runs counter to norms of rule of law and the nature of a transparent and accountable system. The law also criminalizes anyone who circumvents an IP address via third parties, such as a VPN, with intention of committing a crime or preventing its discovery. Although it's unclear how the state would provide evidence of the intention of committing a crime. Additionally, any platform that has more than 100,000 subscribers must establish an office in Jordan to deal with requests from the judiciary, according to this new law. This, in practical terms, will help facilitate more requests and demands to access user accounts and breach individuals' privacy. And lastly, Article 37 of the law provides the right to file a claim against a defendant whether they commit any of the crimes stipulated within the kingdom or outside the kingdom, if their online activities are deemed as causing damage to the interests of the state or any of its citizens or residents. Who knows how that article is going to be used? It's scary. Human rights organizations have deemed this law in direct violation with international human rights laws, standards that require a clear and legitimate aim, necessity, and proportionality when restricting the right to freedom of expression. Opposition lawmaker Saleh al-Harmouti described the law as disastrous and will lead to turning Jordan into a large prison. The chilling effect of this legislation will be great. Self-censorship is already high in the kingdom, and this will only make it more prevalent. This feels like the last nail in the coffin for free expression in Jordan. In the run-up to passing the law, Jordan had already witnessed an unprecedented crackdown on journalists and activists under the old cybercrime law. In the past few years, gag orders have become increasingly common across Jordan on a whole range of issues, such as the matters related to the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, the teachers' syndicate strikes and its subsequent closure, the events of 2021 between the king and the former crown prince, Prince Hamza, who, by the way, is still under house arrest, or cases deemed sensitive by the public prosecutor. In the past year, numerous well-known journalists have been arrested and detained, even at the airport, and interrogated because of social media posts or articles they published. And popular websites have been blocked or limited, including the award-winning satirical website El Hudud and the news outlet Hibr, along with social media platforms Clubhouse, TikTok, and Facebook. Human Rights Watch over the past years has reported increased harassment of journalists and regular instruction by the Mukhabarat or the General Intelligence Directorate on what they can or can't write about. So as a result, many journalists already exercise self-censorship. So-called cybercrime offenses have more than doubled in the past couple of years. And last year, a Citizen Lab report confirmed that NSO's group Pegasus spyware was used to hack the phones of at least 4 Jordanians, including human rights defenders, lawyers, and journalists. And all of this was before the newly passed cybercrime bill, which is even worse. I heard an interview recently where a digital security expert in Jordan was asked, why bother with this new law, since the government was already going after everyone that they wanted and had already established a climate of self-censorship and fear? The interviewee sort of shrugged at this and offered, well, the government now has total cover to prosecute, imprison, and fine anyone at any time for anything they say or do online, and they don't even have to respond to allegations of illegality, which is a very daunting new reality for the majority of the population who are under the age of 30. And their preferred method of joining the so-called public square, engaging socially and politically, is online. If the government can't commit to meaningfully resolving the unemployment crisis and doesn't enjoy the trust of the majority of its population, and political apathy is high, and the elected parliament functions predominantly as a rubber stamp for directives from above, and all forms of speech are highly policed, it becomes unclear what the actual strategy is for the future of Jordan and its young population. Or maybe this is the reality track, or how the reality actually tracks with the proposed 10-year modernization plan that Sean is going to talk about next. Maybe instead, Jordan's actual strategy is becoming increasingly clear, and Jordan is taking the lead from and adopting the authoritarian tools of its neighbors. I'd like to believe and hope that this is not the case. And there is still time to turn things around in the country so that its rhetoric and promise of reform actually better aligns with the reality. In closing, I'd like to recommend, I know I need to provide some recommendations on all these issues. I'll just hit a couple, and I believe that others will probably have some ideas too. So to the Jordanian government, I would just say, please invalidate, revoke the new cybercrime bill. It's not a good idea. Use international law and standards you've already signed on to and ratified as guidance for speech, regulation, and targeted cybercrime legislation. For the United States government and multilateral community, use fora like the Freedom Online Coalition to issue statements against the cybercrime law, engage with the government of Jordan on how to respect freedom of expression and cooperate with civil society. The Department of State has already issued a statement criticizing the law, so it should identify venues like the Freedom Online Coalition to pursue action. And for the Biden administration, push the Jordanian government to live up to its reform commitments. In recent public statements, you've already stated your commitment to encouraging Jordan to do so. The U.S. government provides an immense amount of foreign assistance to Jordan. It has doubled in the past 10 years, culminating in a 2022 memorandum of understanding between the U.S. and Jordan to provide $10.15 billion in aid over the next 7 years. In the last 2 years, the administration has requested from Congress conditioning $250 million of economic support funds on negotiating benchmarks that Jordan must meet toward reform, but Congress has not adopted those. So I encourage Congress to adopt this language. And I also encourage the administration to not wait for Congress. Implement this policy through your programming. Thankfully, a portion of this foreign assistance from the U.S. is focused on democracy and human rights, but despite these investments, Jordan's democracy and human rights record is only getting worse, as we've heard. So USAID should also reevaluate its democracy and human rights programming and determine where funds should best be invested to directly counter this democratic backsliding. Thank you.
Thank you, Arwa. I appreciate all that detail. A lot of food for thought. I hope the audience is preparing their questions. I see a whole bunch of questions already on the question and answer feature. And again, you could also use email, essentially at events@arabcenterdc.org if you would like to send your questions via email. Sean, you're next. You get the next 12 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Khalil. And I'm glad to be here virtually alongside my other panelists. Let me first preface this by saying that many of my comments about Jordan's 10-year political reform project come from a recent Q&A I actually did with Arwa Shabaki here, which is now up live on the Project on Middle East Democracy website. So that's just a plug for I think a very similar like-minded organization that, like all of us, desire a more stable and prosperous Jordan and more broadly in the Middle East. So I've been asked today to talk about the decade-long roadmap of political reform that was released 2 years ago by a royal committee and to assess how much progress has been done in achieving some of its goals. And let me first say that this was, as Curtis has mentioned, a very ambitious project to democratize Jordan. If you read the actual reform roadmap, it's not a slim document. It talks about political parties, empowering parliament, enhancing national representation, gender equality, youth empowerment, economic improvements. The committee that produced the roadmap included over 90 members, making it the largest such reform committee ever assembled over the past quarter century in Jordan. And it carried a significant degree of optimism, perhaps not universal optimism, but far more optimism than previous committees back in 2005 and again in 2011. But in terms of how much progress has been made, the balance suggests that that progress has been incremental and slow. And as our other panelists have noted, this has only amplified the cynicism that many Jordanians have whenever the government does release grandiose promises of political transformation. And there are intersecting factors that go into this as well. As Tuqa has explained, the economic situation is not just devastated, but it continues to devastate and fuel endemic frustration about joblessness, inequality, and corruption. And it's not also only because, as Kurt has explained, that the practice of promising political reforms that are never honored is unfortunately a recurrent pattern in Jordanian politics. And it's not only because, as Arwa has noted, youth disenchantment and desperation runs high. And again, I can't underscore here how high it does, how high it reaches. Tuqa mentioned the Arab Barometer survey. And if you actually look at the most recent wave in 2021, 2022, there is a question about immigration that you can collate by age. And here, to cite a figure that hasn't been noted in our presentations yet, about 2/3 of Jordanians under the age of 30 want to leave the kingdom. So that may not seem extremely high in that some of us may have been guessing the figure was higher. It's higher than Libya. It's higher than Sudan. So it's one of the highest in the region. And one of the reasons why I think cynicism is so endemic is because, as Kurt and others have mentioned, whenever the government does release grand reform projects, the benchmarks are never hit. And here with the Royal Reform Committee's roadmap, there is a very explicit metric of evaluation, and this is what we may want to focus on. It projected Jordan to become a constitutional monarchy in 10 years, essentially by 2032. And this is an enormous political transition to make, for a country that is not obviously yet a constitutional monarchy. Because the primary obstacle for any democratization to occur whenever you're dealing with, I think, non-democratic states is that political actors have to accept the institutionalized uncertainty that comes with meaningful democracy. So one manifestation of this is that no matter the cultural context, democratization means that a society selects its leadership through competitive elections and therefore has a voice in how important issues like foreign policy, the budget, or even national security is crafted. So what that means in the Jordanian context is a radical shift in the nature of power and authority from the current set of political elites and institutions towards an entirely new set of political actors and institutions whose legitimacy is largely rooted in free, fair, and competitive elections. And so what this might mean in practice, that is to say, what would constitutional monarchy mean if Jordan were to ever fully embrace parliamentary democracy, is the following. It would mean that given that the primary driver of parliament is the elected lower house, it would mean that much like the United Kingdom, lower house elections would be the primary arbiter of government. It means that the state and society both must accept electoral outcomes, even if the government elected through parliament is constituted by a coalition of forces that some people severely dislike, such as Islamists and leftists and other popular representatives. It would also mean that once ensconced in a truly representative legislative body, Jordanians can resolve, perhaps once and for all, very thorny questions about national identity, including whether certain parts of society, including the Palestinian majority, can gain representation commensurate with their demographic weight. And above all, this means that this parliamentary government elected by the people would manage certain issues over which now it has very little authority, such as whether Jordan should wage war or make peace, how much money to spend on certain items every year, such as security or the economy or welfare or social services, and other sensitive issues such as the national security file, such as cyber crimes regulations. So thus far, while it's only been 2 years into the roadmap, given this very ambitious benchmark, we can say that there has been very incremental progress, but it's too early to tell, primarily because in a democracy, elections, again, are the key arbiter of political mobilization and a representative government. The next elections are scheduled in Jordan for 2024. That's when the next lower house is scheduled to be elected. And thus far, what we know is that of the 138 seats that would be contested in that election, 41 will come not from the current local districting system, but a national district open only to parties. And so here what the roadmap suggests is that there is a glide path to democracy. Over every election from 2024 onwards until 2032, the proportion of seats elected in parliament will shift incrementally from the current system of local districts, which many Jordanians feel is highly unfair and uncompetitive, to a national districting system open only to parties, such that in the end, parliament will be filled with parties that will espouse their own ideas and govern Jordan democratically. There are obviously a few problems with achieving that vision. One, as Kurt mentioned, is that political parties are extremely weak. And it's not just because the current or the reform of parties law creates a very high threshold for parties to obtain in order to be licensed. It's because the modern history of Jordan since the 1950s is a history of government pressures both against parties and popular mistrust of parties, because the parties that have survived in Jordan for much of its history since the martial law period began in the late 1950s are those that either had to cling to a particular ideology, which can often evoke its own opposition, like leftism or Islamism, or there are parties that never had a chance to build a national infrastructure. Now, the other piece of this reform puzzle is that even if we get a parliament in 2032 that's filled with parties and a new electoral districting system that's far more transparent and representative than the current districting system, this parliament will be the body that selects the prime minister and the government. So I can't underscore enough how important that tipping point would be for a political transition. This has happened maybe once before in Jordanian history in the mid-1950s, and that experiment ended in a political crackdown and 3 decades of martial law. The idea that a nationally representative electoral body will select the prime minister and therefore validate the government and indeed compose the government from its own elected deputies is a drastic and radical shift from the current system in which government and the prime minister are the products of royal appointments rather than electoral outcomes. This also means that this parliamentary government would be the one that crafts the national budget. That could potentially determine military spending. That would determine, in say, if a future pandemic, heaven forbid, occurs, would determine the nature of any lockdown. That would regulate healthcare spending or have ultimate control over the educational system. It would be, in essence, much like the Swedish or the British model of constitutional monarchism that is in play in those countries now. And I am not alone in wondering if and when this could possibly happen, not only because most Jordanians alive today have no living memory of this ever happening, but because we know that there is a two-way street of mistrust flowing between the state and society. Many power holders within the state deeply mistrust anyone elected who could represent public opinion, either because they may embody a certain ideology like Islamism or nationalism or leftism, or because they can't control their policymaking. And conversely, those on the street highly mistrust the state because those in the state have made promises about democracy that they've broken before. So let me end now with just a brief reference to how this roadmap intersects with and inflects upon the regional and the international context, because I think this is another piece of this very jagged puzzle that we need to pay close attention to. So it is true, as all of our panelists have mentioned, that oftentimes regional crises create immense stress on Jordan that often scuttle reform talk. So just think about the last quarter century in Jordan. It has not been kind to the Hashemite kingdom. In the 2000s, Jordanians saw Iraq crumble amidst US war making and at the apex of American hegemony. In the 2010s, it was the Arab Spring and Syria's near collapse. And as Ottawa mentioned, now there are new kinetic threats to Jordanian sovereignty, including drug smuggling from Syria. If you actually read some of the reports coming from the Jordanian-Syrian border, there are weekly drones which are shot down by the US-built border security system up there that are carrying drugs or explosives. But I'm of the belief that regional problems can actually be an opportunity to reform, because I think that using the excuse that the neighborhood is never quite stable enough to experiment with democracy is a very facile excuse, because the reality is that the region will probably never be stable enough in the near future to entertain a meaningful and daring political transition. But imagine a Jordan that is a proud constitutional monarchy in a future Middle East, despite residing next to some of the most illiberal autocracies of the world. Then it would be the true oasis of moderation that the United States government and Congress, as Ottawa has also mentioned, continues to preach Jordan is, but in reality has not yet reached. And that would be my ultimate policy recommendation as well, particularly for those of us who are tuning in from Washington. I would obviously, underscore that Jordan is a key peace partner of Israel. It hosts US military forces. It's an intimate diplomatic ally of Washington, and that there's a natural hesitation in Congress to experiment with the uncertainty of democracy. But the problem, as Tuqa has also mentioned, is that the true threat to Jordanian stability, and in fact, all the region, is not just geopolitics or the outside world. It is when alienated population are discontented so deeply that they rise up in rage and protest and then threaten to tear down their own governments. That is, I think, what is happening now. And that's what we have to be very nervous about and hopeful for in terms of the reform roadmap in Jordan moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Very challenging recommendations for everybody concerned, including our own discussions. So let's go ahead and move quickly into the Q&A. We have a lot of questions from the audience, and I would like to begin with a question of my own. I'm going to address it to Arwa with regard to her statement or item that she mentioned in her remarks. The spread of authoritarian tools in the region. Is Jordan immune to that, or is it copying some of that, the fear of that spreading into Jordan? And it's interesting that this morning, an article in the Economist is entitled, "The Gulf Countries Want to Reshape the Middle East in Their Image." Is Jordan subject to that pressure, considering its own dependence on aid from these countries, without naming them all? But is that something to worry about in terms of reform in Jordan? Arwa, go ahead. And others, if you'd like to comment on that, please feel free to do so. Go ahead, Arwa.
Thanks, Khalil. It's always fun to start off with the easy questions. I think absolutely. I think there is real concern that Jordan is learning from its neighbors. I mean, you see the cybercrime law is just one example of a law. There are association laws. There are lots of laws that get mimicked and duplicated and shared amongst sort of authoritarian regimes in the region. Egypt is one great example of a government that has gone to extremes really to suppress dissent and to imprison opposition and everything else. And there is absolutely concern that Jordan is going that direction. As a country with very, as you stated, no actual natural resources. Jordan is a very poor country, and that's something that everybody needs to sort of remember about Jordan. I mean, yes, it has some phosphorus or phosphate mining or minerals that they do export, but largely tourism, and it's sort of its creation as a peaceful and refugee housing nation and a friend to all has really helped Jordan maintain and sustain its existence and identity. And that is under threat with this increased sort of authoritarian trend, and it is also it also makes Jordan vulnerable to the influences of its patrons, to the influences of those countries that do provide aid and assistance to it. And with Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Gulf states positioning themselves and supporting and providing aid and assistance to Jordan, nothing comes free of charge, and it doesn't come free from United States or any other country as well. Everybody's got their interests. So yes, of course, there's concern.
Okay, thank you. And would anybody else care to comment on the same question? The authoritarian tendencies spreading throughout the region, especially in light of this article that the Gulf countries want to reshape the Middle East in their image, if that's true.
Yes, Khalil, I would just reinforce what Ottawa said. I think that, what's happening now in Jordan, and it's not just a Jordanian story. We see this with Egypt, Morocco as well, is that, we're seeing a process that we political scientists call diffusion, and that certain practices such as deepening authoritarian abuses or say digital regulations tend to spread through emulation and adoption between states who all worry about the same thing, which are popular protests or domestic instability. If you go back to, for instance, the counter-terror, the anti-terror laws of Jordan, and compare them to some of the counter-terror laws or anti-terror laws in the Gulf states, there are some striking similarities. If you compare the new cybercrimes law in Jordan with, say, the Emirati cybercrimes law again, there are some striking similarities. This is not to say that one is responsible for the other, but it is to say that I think you're absolutely right, Khalil. We can't talk about the politics of Jordan and this tendency to go back to justifying the strictures on personal freedoms through deepening authoritarianism if we ignore the regional context, because Jordan does not live in a vacuum. And I think its borders are porous, both literally and figuratively. And its practices tend to be profoundly shaped and often emulating of some of its more autocratic neighbors.
Thank you, Sean. Just wanted to add here editorially, if you don't mind, this is not pick on Jordan Day as much as looking at trends in the region, as Sean just gratefully added to the discussion here, because there are so many things that are applicable across the board. There are trends throughout the region that seem to impact these governments. And Jordan, in a way, is an open case study for us today. But what we're talking about definitely applies to many others. Toka, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that laws can be replicated or policies can be replicated, but the fabric of Jordanian society differs significantly from that in the Gulf. And the history of political activism, protests, strikes is not present in the Gulf. And so you can replicate laws, but you may not be able to anticipate the same response. So I think the Jordanian government is well aware of how far it can go with the Jordanian public, that not the same things that can be applied in Gulf countries can fly in a country like Jordan.
Thank you, Toka. Curtis?
Yeah, I wanted to riff on that a little bit and add to that. I do think the regional context, as Sean said, is utterly vital to get what goes on inside Jordanian politics. And to say it's been challenging, in the last several years would be really an understatement, not just even with the obvious issues of COVID or this massive, yet another round of refugee crises for the kingdom, in this case, Syrian refugees. But, Jordan relies on its external relationships very deeply. It's an aid-dependent country, and that includes the Gulf states. So it's always under pressure from the GCC states. That pressure is not always going in the same direction because the GCC is not always united. I mean, look at the Qatar crisis of 2017, for example, right? But even at that moment, I think you can see Jordan occupies this sort of foreign policy alliance obsessive space where it is trying to very often for this middle path, if it's available. And if it's not available, make one anyway, and try to go down there and do a sort of bizarre juggling experiment where it's trying to maintain its international global alliances with countries like the US and Britain and its relationship with the European Union without alienating them, and somehow manage not to alienate its desperate connections to its Gulf allies as well, even as it's expanding. I mean, Jordan has noticeably expanded its options in its relationships in the last several years, in part because of the difficulty of the Trump years, where Jordanians felt really deeply neglected, and in fact were in almost blind panic about where the deal of the century might go and what that mean for Jordanian society and politics, and therefore fanned out to this relationship right now with Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and also even just stabilizing relationships, not alliances, but just stabilizing the relationships with, say, Turkey, Iran at a global level, Russia, China. That's a lot of different balls in the air that are going on here. And meanwhile, there's always Gulf pressure. And I like the way Tuka just said it. Jordan domestically is a very different society. So there are limits to how much it could or should even try to do it. And even there, I think it tries to go for a middle position of trying not to get dragged into the Yemen war, for example, or not as draconian a response to the Muslim Brotherhood. Like a lot, and I'm not saying it's been benign, but having the movement split with one part legal and the other part illegal, but that's not the same as the way Egypt or Saudi Arabia or the Emirates approach the same thing. So I think that set of relationships, there are multiple competing pressures on Jordan, of which the most local are the Gulf ones.
All right, thank you. Let's go ahead and answer some of the questions from the audience. I'm going to combine the first two. They're both addressed to you, Curtis. With regards to the role of the monarchy, what is exactly the political role of the king when it comes to reform in Jordan? And one of you mentioned earlier a comparison between that and the reference to constitutional monarchy like the UK, for example? Is there a place to compare? Go ahead, Curtis.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison, actually. But for the purpose of contrast, so that if there's been some debate in Jordan for years about constitutional monarchy, and I think it's best understood the way Sean presented it, which is it's a legal concept. It's not a country that has a constitution and a monarchy, because Jordan has those. It's a system where the monarchy is now limited in its powers, and the constitutional system has shifted power towards a democratically elected parliament. Hence the UK example, where yes, there's a monarchy, but it's largely cultural as a and social as a symbol, and almost all power is vested in the prime minister, the cabinet, and the democratically elected legislature. Jordan is almost the opposite, I would say, of that. It has a parliament, there are elections, they are competitive to a large extent, but it's a very weak parliament. It has very little power. Most power is vested in the monarchy. So it's possible, by the way, in this long range of reform that we're looking at, because as Sean said, that the full constitutional monarchy that's a pretty ambitious end goal there. It's possible we end up somewhere in between, even if the reforms take place as scheduled and as planned, which would mean, for example, more and more empowerment to parliament, prime minister and cabinet drawn from parliament eventually, but not in the next election cycle. And yet some very significant powers, as with recent constitutional reforms, would be reserved still for the monarchy. Almost everything connected to foreign policy, defense, and security and intelligence, I'm guessing, is still there. So not a true constitutional monarchy. But since right now we're talking about almost opposite poles of that general model, Jordan can still slide along that scale, not get all the way to the UK level, or model, but still have seen some fairly dramatic change. That's a big if, but I think that's a possibility.
Thank you very much. Sean, Ziad asked a question also with regards to an item that you did mention a while ago about Jordan having peace agreement with Israel. And to what extent is the situation in Palestine, or the continued occupation in Palestine, to what extent does it impact that turmoil that we have been discussing in Jordan with regard to socioeconomic and political reform in the country?
Oh, that's a great question. So the short answer is it doesn't help. And the long answer is that it tends to amplify social and economic problems, but it also tends to drag down any impetus for political reform. And this is often construed in very sensitive terms in local debates in Jordan, because it cuts also to the heart of Jordanian history and Jordanian national identity. As we know, or as kind of as conventional wisdom holds, the majority of some number of Jordanian society have Palestinian origin, which leaves some minority of varying numbers having non-Palestinian, or what we call, as some of us know, trans-Jordanian origins, the majority of which of that segment comprises tribes and tribal communities that trace their heritage on the East Bank prior to the Hashemite arrival through British colonialism in the 1920s. And so the idea of the current occupation and the grotesque dismemberment of the Palestinian dream by the Israeli government now impacts Jordan and the impetus for reform in a few very clear ways. For one, because Jordan is existentially tied to the project of having an independent and sovereign Palestinian state, the foreclosure of that dream through the increasing acceptance of the one-state model over the past decade has opened up fears among some very conservative quarters of Jordanian politics, often egged on by certain, I think, hyper-nationalist voices, that the true Israeli project in the region is to actually deport or expel Palestinians living in what the Israeli government calls Greater Israel onto the East Bank, thereby effectively making Jordan, as some of us know, the Watan Badil, the alternative or substitute homeland. That is not just a red line for the monarchy and the security apparatus, that is a red line for most Jordanians. The problem is that as this potential tragedy, and in fact, not just tragedy, catastrophe comes closer into potential realization, any enthusiasm that the state has for political reform tends to slow down. Because again, as we saw during the Iraqi crisis of the 2000s and the Syrian crisis of the 2010s, when there is a regional explosion, it is very easy for the Jordanian state to point towards the needs of national security to then justify slowing down any past reforms or pledges to transform their political or economic order, and to just take a step back and say, there's too much instability in our region. We have too many threats lying just across our borders. We need to take a step back, take a deep breath, and wait just a few years, and then we promise to return to this reform project. The problem is they never return to this, which is why they keep on convening royal committees to formulate new reform projects. And I would say the other reason why, I mean, there are many intersections, but I'll end here. The second way that this intersects with and undermines the potential for political change in Jordan is that Jordan, Jordan is no longer unique, because now it seems like Israel is collecting peace partners and normalization allies in the region. But we have to remember, Jordan was just the second Arab state to do this in 1994. And for a long time, it looked like it would be the second and the last. And so by normalizing ties with Israel in 1994, Jordan's fate became intertwined with both Israel and the United States, because it's by serving as effectively Israel's security buffer on its eastern flank that Jordan often is able to retain such powerful bipartisan support in Congress. Many congressional officials, unfortunately, know Jordan by just two things. Number one, it's a monarchy, and number two, it's made peace with Israel. And so long as there is a potential for any renewed conflict in that Israeli-Jordanian relationship, there's going to be pressure from Washington on Jordan to maintain or hold the line, to not do anything drastic, and to maintain that peace treaty. Now, as Washington does this, what issues get shuffled down the agenda? It's anti-corruption initiatives, it's political reform, it's improving the economy. Because the nervousness in Congress is that anything that could possibly perturb Israel is going to be bad for the region. And if Jordan's the one that could be perturbing Israel, then Jordan should be pressured or supported into remaining stable, such as providing more economic aid to Amman or upgrading its other institutions within the state. All things which are obviously important, but completely orthogonal to the issue of empowering Jordanian citizens to have a voice in their own decision-making, which is the heart of democracy. And that's, I think, unfortunately, how the current occupation of Palestine has had a destructive effect on these political discussions in Amman.
Thank you, Sean. And I think your analysis is definitely apropos in light of the nature of the current Israeli government, particularly, and the unique threat that presents to stability and security in Jordan. And it's kind of interesting that those in Washington who have these days elevated normalization and the basically upkeep of the previous agreements normalizing relations with Israel could care less what the public in Jordan or in the rest of the Arab world care. I mean, the fact that Jordan has had a peace treaty with Israel for 10 years, but a tepid, if you will, support or relationship with the public in Jordan or anywhere else, where you get an Arab public in various countries that ranges between 60 to 98% lack of support for normalization, is not taken into consideration by decision makers here in Washington, who made it their kind of the backbone of their Middle East policy at this time. Arwa, a couple of questions came in with regards to your reference or recommendations to the U.S. with regards to Jordan, the special relationship, more pressure on Jordan to live up to reform, the role that you suggested for both the administration and Congress in this regard. Is this feasible? Do you expect the U.S. to respond positively to that recommendation? And what is the U.S. getting really in return as a result of this special kind of relationship with Jordan?
Thank you for those good, important questions. I mean, I think absolutely it's feasible. The U.S. has been Jordan's closest ally for, decades. And we provide, U.S. taxpayers provide, have provided billions of dollars to Jordan to help balance its budget on an annual basis, and to address necessary reforms, or supposedly to address necessary reforms, and provide all kinds of infrastructure projects, et cetera. So, the United States plays a very significant role in Jordan. So, it has a lot of tools, and it has a lot of leverage, and it has a lot of close relationships that it can certainly, put pressure where pressure is needed. The United States is also very aware of the situation in Jordan. We're here sharing public information, and not because we want to be antagonistic or pick on Jordan, as you previously stated, but because there is so much potential, and the United States plays such an important role. And so, yes, is there hope? Sure, we have to be hopeful. That's why we talk about this, and that's why we have these recommendations. In terms of what the United States gets in return, or why is Jordan such a valuable ally to the United States? As Sean talked about, Jordan has a long history since 1994, the signing of the Wadi Hadaba Pact. Its peace treaty with Israel. It was only the second country, I think, after Egypt to do so. And this was historically very important for the United States, but I think in more modern day, the U.S. interests, military interests and strategy across the region is really based out of Jordan. The United States has thousands of troops in Jordan. The United States conducts, many military trainings, police trainings, all the rest of it. The list is very long. The United States depends on Jordan as an ally for its military strategic, interests across the region. And I think that that's probably a major part of the relationship. And then not to discount the importance of Jordan's ability to host waves of refugees. You've got sort of the historical foundation of Jordan on the heels of the occupation, the creation of the Israeli state, and the Nakba and exodus of Palestinians to the Jordanian state. You have waves from the Iraq War. You have most recent wave from Syria. Jordan is also host to these major, like thousands and thousands, millions of people at this point in time who have been displaced, and the United States depends on Jordan to help provide homes to the displaced, and to stop them from migrating elsewhere, and maintain some stability. So Jordan is essential. It's an important country for the United States, and that's why all of these issues are important, and we're talking about them today.
A huge challenge for a small country like Jordan, with its socioeconomic problems that we have discussed. Ali Hijazi Tuqa, would like you, if you could talk a little bit more about subnational identities in Jordan and their role in potential change and reform in the country.
Sure. There are a number of subnational identities in Jordan, primarily, as we touched on, those of Palestinian origin, but there are also Circassian Jordanians. There are a number of other identities that have generally been well integrated into the country's system. You don't necessarily see that certain identities are targeted, but I think if there will be a broad modernization agenda for the economy and for the political system, they need to tap into all of the minorities that live in the country and get their buy-in. I think there tends to be in the Middle East affiliations and people, whether it's the tribal affiliation that supersedes any kind of other identity, sometimes can conflict with these subnational identities. And so in understanding how to make each individual Jordanian feel like they are a citizen that is able to cast their vote and participate in the system, regardless of what their origins are, what their sub-identity is to being Jordanian, that's an important part of this reform agenda. If anyone feels marginalized, if any community feels marginalized, that's going to cause a problem for the government. And but generally speaking, I think those groups in Jordan have been much better integrated than they have been in other countries where you see a lot more tension between them.
Thank you, Tuka. Curtis, William Grant would like to know, why haven't the economic conditions that we've discussed, as vulnerable as they are, why didn't they force the monarchy in Jordan to accept the Trump administration's plan in return for financial assistance at the time?
I'm not sure. I assume it's the main Trump plan we're talking about here, but Jordan was already
a more active role in normalization.
Right. I think a couple of things. Jordan already had a peace treaty with Israel, as several people point out, going all the way back to 1994, and was already accepting also massive amounts of U.S. aid from U.S. administrations before, during, after the Trump years. So the one thing that was, that those were constants. I would say that the peace treaty was still held. The foreign aid, both economic and military, and extensive intel cooperation and things like that was still going on. So the part that was different, I think, was that diplomatically speaking, Jordan and its king, its officials, etc., were used to extensive connections to their counterparts in Washington, which they really weren't getting for a mere 4-year period over the entire history of that relationship. And those were the Trump years that Jordan felt sidelined, because it appeared that part of the Trump plan, that includes the normalizations, was designed to have U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East go mainly through a kind of trio of the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And a lot of U.S. policy seemed to be dictated, honestly, on WhatsApp between a handful of leaders and Jared Kushner. For the Jordanians, this was really, really alarming. So they didn't forego any aid. That's not an issue. And they didn't give up or trash their peace treaty with Israel, despite the fact that anti-normalization at the social level has been part of Jordanian politics since 1994. There's been pressure to do exactly that over the years, and especially in times of high tension. And we're in those times now, by the way. The Netanyahu relationship with Jordan has always been abysmal. And even on a personal level. So I think we're back at that kind of a crisis level. But the Jordanians, I think, were more interested in holding on to what they had, making sure that some of the worst options, like Sean was saying, that there would be no alternative homeland floated, even with different language, that would get past them. So I think Jordan really saw some of this as kind of existential at a social level, in terms of their international diplomacy and standing, their historic role as mediator. A lot of things were being obliterated in that period, and they were looking more, I think they treated it more like the way you would treat a hurricane, hunker down, get through these 4 years, hope something changes, and then try to reestablish the relationship with the U.S., with regional partners, etc., and reestablish Jordan's historic role, and including its continuing aid relationship, which they managed to do.
Thank you, Curtis. Let's conclude with this question to Sean from Ismail Dahiyat. Clearly, the majority, as several of you have pointed out, of the Jordanian people are somewhat cynical about the ruling powers in Jordan. What can be done, again, in summary, to restore that trust between the people of Jordan and the government, or the governmental institutions in Jordan, including the palace, on the other hand, in short term? Sean.
That's a great question. So, I mean, one policy maneuver that would instantly be accepted and, in fact, embraced by many Jordanians is engaging in a sincere system-wide crackdown on corruption, because corruption within the state ranks as one of the most salient and, in fact, enraging issues that often drives Jordanians onto the street. I think another less quotidian policy would be simply follow the roadmap that the government has set out for reform. And I think this often gets lost when scholars like ourselves debate issues of reform. The reason why ideas like constitutional monarchy or parliamentary government, or the ruling monarchy no longer actually ruling and giving up much of its powers, The reason why we've been discussing this is that the Jordanian government and the monarchy itself has made these promises. So the cynicism of many Jordanians is born out of the fact that it's not as if they read this in a textbook and they're protesting this on the street and no one hears them. They'll point to the government's own promises and say, and they will say, you are the ones who introduced this into our agenda. Why would you not achieve them? Why would you introduce them if you never had any intention of achieving them at all? That is worse than having never mentioned this at all in the first place. The last thing I'll say is that I think doing the unexpected in a bold, unpredictable way on the side of reform would, I think, win the hearts and minds of many Jordanians. So to go back to one of Ottawa's points, annulling, reviewing, retracting the cybercrimes law, that would do immense bridge building to many of the youths who now are not just alienated, but scared that their past Facebook posts or their social media feeds would be evidence in a state security court for criminal prosecution because they have inflamed public order or hurt brotherly relations with another Arab country. So something like that would be instant political capital, and it would be something that I think would be obviously far easier to do than change the entire political system and embrace a British-style monarchy overnight.
Thank you, Sean, very much. Our time just ended exactly at this moment. It's 11:30, and I would like to thank our great panelists for their superb presentations, for shedding so many lights on the complexity of the issues we're talking about and their relevance for the whole region. So thank you, Arwa, Tuka, Curtis, Sean. Thank you all for your taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. I would like to invite the audience again to join us for future webinars at Arab Center. We have a great conference coming before the end of the month on the one-day conference. It's one of our biannual conferences on the 27th of this month, focusing on the future of democracy in the region, which is central to our mission and at the Arab Center. So please join us for that. Thank you to particularly those in the audience today who sent some questions, but I couldn't get to all of them. Otherwise, we will be here through the weekend. So thank you so much. We're in touch, so you stay in touch, and welcome again to all the people who participated in this webinar. I wish everybody peace.